Hello to everyone who's watching right now. To everyone who's watching right now, or might end up watching this stream in the future. Like, comment, subscribe. Also, feel free to check out any of the playlists that are available on my channel. For example, the stream playlist, which contains all the streams I've done at this point, as well as my Medora musical playlist that contains all the videos I posted to my channel about the Medora musical I saw during the summer of 2007, along with my UDJ playlist that now contains 2,140 songs on it, videos actually, which is a lot. So, one thing that's pretty interesting about the Civil War is that it's easy to think that the cause of this war was slavery, but that's not necessarily the case. The main reason for this is because not everyone in the South actually cared about slavery, because the ones who cared about it were the rich plantation owning whites, whereas poor whites didn't care about slavery because they didn't own slaves. So the bigger, more fundamental issue that the North and South disagreed on was federal power versus state rights. The North supported federal power, while the South supported state rights. In fact, this issue actually goes back a long time. It actually goes back to the Federalist versus the anti Federalist. This is before the Constitution was ratified by all the states and thus put into effect. At this point, the Articles of Confederation were technically still in effect, but the Constitution had been written and it just needed to be ratified in order to be put into effect. The Federalists supported this new Constitution, whereas the Anti Federalists opposed it on the grounds that they believed it would give too much power to the federal government at the expense of the states. The Articles of Confederation gave a lot of power to the states while not giving much power at all to the federal government. In fact, the federal government under the Articles of Confederation only consisted of one house of Congress. That's it. There was no executive or judicial branch. There was only the legislative branch. And even though there was a legislative branch, it didn't have much power. In fact, it didn't even have the power to raise taxes. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was allowed to ask the states for money, but importantly, the states are under no obligation to give the federal government any money, which ended up being a really big problem because this means that the US was unable to pay back debt that it owed to foreign governments, like France, for example, that had helped out the colonies during the Revolutionary War. In fact, because there were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation, it only took a couple years for a lot of individuals to realize that the Articles of Confederation were not working, that there needed to be a new system put into place because the Articles of Confederation were simply not sustainable. Fundamentally, that was because at that time, America was afraid of giving too much power to the executive branch, which is understandable because of the colony's experience with Great Britain. But what this meant is that they ended up giving too much power to the states at the expense of the federal government. And this led to a very ineffective government that was unable to take care of problems. In fact, there was this rebellion that occurred a couple years after the Articles of Confederation were put into effect, and this led to several important individuals like George Washington, along with others, really seeing the flaws with the Articles of Confederation. So, going all the way back to the early days of the United States, there was disagreement about federal power versus state rights. And then, shortly before the Civil War actually began, shortly before the Southern states seceded from the US, there was a lot of disagreement. Yeah, and this is something that I've learned about before back in school because I learned about it during history class, but I don't remember much of the details. It had to do with it had to do with alcohol, whiskey. I'm pretty sure it's about it's about it was about farmers that that weren't happy because of because of whiskey tax. I'm pretty sure, and so they caused a lot of trouble, but unfortunately, the federal government was unable to intervene because they had so little power under the Articles of Confederation. And therefore, a lot of people became convinced that a new system needed to be put into effect. And Dad, feel free to post about anything you know about this time period or about the issue of federal power versus states' rights or the Civil War, anything that you want. Maybe I went on for a bit there, but I want you to be part of this conversation as well. So feel feel free to post. So when it comes to the reason why, hey, hey Linda, thanks for joining today. That's a good question in terms of who felt that the federal government needed to be stronger. Well, George Washington for one, but also people like John Adams, James Madison, um, John Jay. I'm thinking this coming back to me now. Those were some of the Federalists who thought that the federal government needed to be stronger. Olinda, feel free to post out anything you know regarding this topic as well, or anything about history in general. Doesn't have to be a civil war, but anything that personally interests you, or any book or TV show or movie that you know about that has to do with history, feel free to post about that as well. After the southern states seceded from the Union, they took over this Union fort down in Virginia. President Lincoln became aware of this, and it put him into a difficult position. because, on the one hand, he didn't want to have the Confederacy legitimate be recognized as a legitimate nation, since he believed that they were simply a group of states that were in rebellion against the Union. He didn't think that they had any legitimate right to secede, since he didn't think that the Constitution allowed them to do so. But on the other hand, he didn't want to send warships to that fort, is Fort Sumter, because he knew that if he did that, then it would look like the Union started the Civil War. So instead, in a rather savvy bit of political maneuvering, Lincoln instead just just sent a group of ships to Fort Sumter that contained food or supplies along those lines. Oh, Joe, interesting. You're listed as P. Linda. Okay. Yeah, that's true actually regarding Alexander Hamilton. He absolutely was a supporter of greater federal power. In fact, when he was part of when he was part of George Washington's cabinet, he absolutely was a supporter of greater federal power. In fact, he actually supported the first Bank of America. I don't remember if that's what it's called exactly, but he he supported the idea of a new bank being created, while while another member of George Washington's cabinet, I think it was James Madison, if I remember right, he was the exact opposite of Alexander Hamilton in many ways, because he was more of a supporter of state rights. This meant that the two of them actually disagreed a lot when they were both in Lincoln's cabinet, in George Washington's cabinet, sorry. In fact, this led to political parties being formed, which is really ironic because George Washington was not a fan of political parties. He made that very clear during his presidency. And then, when he gave his farewell address once he was done being president, he said that there should not be any political parties, which is actually very ironic because political parties already were being formed when George Washington was president. And then, as time went on, the the status quo absolutely changed, especially right before the Civil War, because the two major political parties that existed at that time started to become fractured, and so they started to split into smaller parties. And then at the same time, there was some smaller parties that came into existence, like the Free Soil Party, for example. That was a smaller third party that came into existence shortly before the Civil War. And this was also the time when the Republican Party, as we know it today, came into existence. It was actually known as the Party of Lincoln. So at that point, you started to have Democrats and Republicans as we have today. But when Lincoln sent those ships to Fort Sumter, what happened is that the Confederacy ended up firing the first shot. This led to the Civil War starting. What this meant is that Lincoln was able to say that the Confederacy started the Civil War, not the Union. That's the main reason why Lincoln did this is he wanted it to look like the Confederacy started the war to ensure that the Union would have plausible deniability on its side. That ended up working really well. In fact, what's interesting is that before the Civil War began, while the North generally was not in favor of slavery and the South was in favor of it, even if in the North there wasn't agreement on this matter, because on the one hand you had the abolitionist who believed that slavery is wrong and needs to be stopped right now. It needs to be stopped immediately. But then you also had Northerners who were in favor of gradual emancipation, meaning that they believe that yes, slavery is bad, but it will take time to end it and slaveholders should be compensated. Well, abolitionists did not believe that should happen at all. Dad, that's absolutely true. If you go into the South nowadays, there's definitely people down there who believe that the Civil War was the war of Northern aggression. So it's really interesting because you had the abolitionists, the Northerners who believed in gradual emancipation, and then the Northerners who believed that slavery should not expand any further than it already had, but they weren't in favor of getting rid of slavery where it already existed. So in the North, there was very much a spectrum in terms of people's opinions. You had some people who are on one end of the spectrum, that would be the abolitionist, and then the other end of the spectrum, you have the Northerners who believe that slavery simply should not expand any further than it already had. And then you had the ones who were in the middle, the ones who were in favor of gradual emancipation. In fact, an interesting thing is that even though slavery ended up being abolished, ultimately due to the passage of the 13th Amendment, before that, the Emancipation Proclamation, right at the beginning of the Civil War, throughout the first couple of years, the first 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, Lincoln stated that the goal of the Civil War is not to end slavery, but simply to restore the Union. Dad, that's also absolutely true because that was not easy. That was not easy to do. So it's quite impressive that Lincoln was able to keep the Union together. The main reason why Lincoln decided not to immediately publicly state that the goal of the Civil War is to end slavery is because he believed that doing so would cause the border states to leave the Union. The border states were states that were in the South but did not secede from the Union. They remained in the Union. Lincoln did not want these border states to leave the Union because he believed that it would be a major blow. And so he decided to just say the Civil War is about keeping the Union together. And Joe, feel free to post anything that you know about the Civil War or some movie you've seen before that deals with this topic, or some book you've read before, TV show you've seen, whatever the case may be. Actually, there is a movie that has been made that's called Lincoln. I don't remember when it came out or who directed it, but I know that that movie has been made. In fact, Dad, you remember how me, you, Mom, as well as Grandma and Grandpa went to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. That was really interesting. I think you would agree with that because you and me got to see this diorama of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's rather detailed and rather big as well. So it's very impressive, really nice to look at. In fact, you and me also got to go on top of this hill that was very important during the Civil War. But also, you guys are free to post about something else related to history. It can be about some other war or some other event that you find interesting, whatever you want. The Battle of Gettysburg was quite important for the Civil War. Oh, Joe, that's interesting. I wasn't aware there's a movie that has been made called Glory. I don't think I've heard of that before. Yeah, Dad, I would agree. Gettysburg was absolutely amazing. And also, I did not remember that the hill was called Little Round Top. What was important about the Battle of Gettysburg is that that was the last time the Confederacy fought the North on Union soil, on Northern soil. And after that, the Confederacy was gradually more and more losing the war. They kept being pushed further and further into the South. Dad, you've seen the movie Glory before. That's great to hear. Also, Joe, Matthew Broderick is absolutely a good actor. I have no doubt that I've seen him before in various movies. In fact, Dad, you remember how me, you, and Mom saw that movie Hacksaw Ridge in theaters? That is a great movie. That one deals with World War One. It tells a true story of this guy named Desmond Doss who being a ended up being a field medic during World War One because he absolutely refused to pick up a weapon due to the fact that he morally disagreed with using a weapon. And even though he was made fun of by other people and he was even accused of being a coward, he ended up showing incredible bravery. In fact, the people who made the movie Hacksaw Ridge said that they cut some things out because it would, quote unquote, make the movie look unrealistic. They cut out some of the things that Desmond Doss actually did in real life that are also really brave. Because they thought that this is just too amazing to show in the movie. The interesting thing actually about the Emancipation Proclamation is that even though it absolutely had symbolic value, it helped to ensure that European nations like Great Britain did not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate state. That was something that Lincoln wanted to avoid at all cost. The Emancipation Proclamation also was limited in in its effectiveness, practically speaking, both because of the exact language that it used, and also because of the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation was not a constitutional amendment or a law. It was simply an executive wartime order, which means it was only in effect for as long as the Civil War persisted. Once the war was over, the proclamation was no longer in effect. In fact, as Lincoln knew, once the war was over, it could be struck down by the courts as being unconstitutional. Joe, have you seen other movies that are either about the Civil War or something else that's related to history? Dad, have you seen and either go ahead and post about those or some other some other type of content. The Emancipation Proclamation specifically stated that slaves who were in there. Dad, that's interesting to hear. They did not know about the limits that the proclamation had. Yeah, what it said is that any slaves who are in areas that are not under Union control are free. But what this meant is that slaves who were in border states that had not left the Union were not freed because those slaves were in areas that were under Union control. In fact, even though the proclamation stated that slaves who are in Confederate areas are free, in practice, that didn't necessarily mean that all the slaves were freed immediately, but they were definitely freed as the war went on, especially as the North went further and further into the South, and the Confederacy kept being pushed further and further back to their capital. In fact, the North was at times fairly brutal this during this time, especially when they burned railroad tracks or bridges. This was due to a strategy that was being used. I don't remember the name of it, but the point of this was to basically destroy anything that stood in the way or that could help the Confederacy. So, as General Sherman, I think his name was, and the Union went further and further into the South, they would destroy crops or kill animals or burn or tie up railroad tracks in order to hurt the Confederacy. And what really didn't help either is that the Confederacy at this point was running out of everything, really. They were running out of food, they were running out of supplies that they needed. And one of the other big problems is that the South never became very industrialized. The North was much more industrialized. So, for example, the North had a lot more railroads than the South did. This really helped out the Union during the Civil War, and it really hurt the Confederacy because they weren't able to move supplies or food, whatever the case may be, around that quickly. And what the Union did is they created this strategy where they took control of important ports and then just kept squeezing the Confederacy in more and more. In fact, this was coined the Anaconda strategy, I think was the name of it. The idea here is that just like how a snake like an anaconda constrict, or a rattlesnake, I think too, constricts its prey, wraps around them until, of course, they're dead. That was basically what the Union did, is they just kept constricting the Confederacy more and more and more. In act, the interesting thing is that right before the Civil War started, Lincoln spoke in many different parts of the country. He spoke both in the North and in the South, meaning sometimes he was speaking to abolitionists, while other times he was speaking to Southerners who couldn't stand the thought of living alongside African Americans. So if President Lincoln was giving a speech that he knew abolitionists would be listening to, he would talk about how evil slavery was, that it needed to be abolished immediately because he knew that was what they wanted to hear. While if he, on the other hand, if he was in the South speaking with either Southerners who owned slaves or Southerners who were afraid of living alongside African Americans, he would say, if slavery continues to expand further than it already has, then at a certain point, inevitably, Southerners will have to, or whites will have to, live alongside African Americans. So you can see here that President Lincoln was rather politically savvy because he was pretty much telling these different groups of people what he knew they wanted to hear. There's no doubt that Lincoln is one of the most famous presidents in US history. When you look at all the presidents throughout history, most people anyway would agree that Lincoln, Washington, Theodore Roosevelt were some of the most well known by far. George Washington is, of course, famous for being the first president, the one who set precedent, and then Roosevelt was famous for his New Deal. No, that's not. Is that right? I'm not sure, but he put a lot of new policies into 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 effect that changed a lot of things about America. For example, back then, conditions at the meatpacking plants were pretty bad. In fact, this yeah, actually, Joe, that's very true. FDR is quite famous as well. One of the big reasons for this is because he's the only president that has ever served 3 terms. Every other president has served either 2 terms or just one, or in the case of one president anyway, served just a couple months. That would be one of the presidents that's not very well known at all. But FDR was the one who led the United States during world during World War One, and I think he was the president during the Great Depression. Yeah, he was. He's the one who put the New Deal into place, which is a set of policies that was designed to get America out of the Great Depression, the worst depression that this country has ever faced throughout its entire history. And the New Deal ended up having a mixed effect. There's people are pretty have always been divided as to how effective the New Deal actually was. Oh, Dad, that's a good clarification to make there. I forgot that FDR was the president during World War II. Yeah, that's one of the big reasons why he's so well known. In fact, the interesting thing about World War II is that America, at first anyway, did not join the war. This country only joined the war after it had already begun, because there's very much a feeling that America should not get involved in other countries' affairs. Their problems are not our problems. They don't affect us. But that ended up changing, especially because FDR did what he called fireside chats, where he would where he would give speeches using the radio, and this ended up being very important because he talked about the fact that if the if the Axis powers were successful, then that would end up affecting the US in the long term. Oh, Joe, that's interesting there. Many presidents after the Civil War served as officers. Grant, McKinley, Hayes, Garfield. Huh. I did not remember that at all. Yeah, those are two presidents that are definitely not as well known. In fact, I'm trying to remember now when they actually were presidents. McKinley, that was during the time of like Coolidge and uh, others. I think he, I think he was president before the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression began, I think he may have been president during the Roaring Twenties. I remember that Calvin Coolidge definitely was a president during the Roaring Twenties, when it seemed like everything was going well, but in reality, there was a lot of problems that had already become evident. Oh, Joe, that's really interesting. I did not remember that Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's vice president. Okay, so that means that McKinley was president before Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt was the president after the Great Depression. Yeah, I remember that. I remember that for sure. He created a lot of policies that ended up impacting America a lot. For example, he's the one who signed he's the one who signed laws that aim to improve conditions in the meat packing plants due to the book The Jungle, written by muckraker Upton Sinclair. Muckrakers were journalists who were trying to unearth problems in society so that they could be fixed. There were a good amount of muckrakers. One of them was named Isabel. Uh, I don't I don't remember the name here, but another one of the problems back then was they had these corporations that would achieve a monopoly, and this meant that there was pretty much no competition because one company owned would buy out a lot of other companies. uh, Interesting, Joe. FDR's after the Depression, and Theodore Roosevelt was around 1900. Huh. Interesting. Okay, so FDR was not the president during the Great Depression. Hmm. Interesting. I don't remember who actually was president back then. And Joe, if you want to post about that, feel free to do so. Dad, also feel free to post about like the Great Depression or some of these presidents or anything else that has to do with history. Actually, here's something that's pretty interesting. There's this book that I've read before called Pillars of the Earth. In fact, actually, I think I have it around here. Um, yeah, that oh, Joe. Okay, as it turns out, I was actually right. Okay, so this right here is a book I've read before called Pillars of the Earth, written by author Ken Follett. There's actually a board game that's based on this book that I've owned for years. In fact, Dad, you remember how me and you have played Pillars of the Earth many times before. Admittedly, we've played the strategy game Stone Age more often before, but we can agree that both games are a lot of fun. Oh, Dad, that's a good point there. That Theodore Roosevelt, but not FDR, is on Mount Rushmore. So you remember how me, you, and Mom went to Mount Rushmore several years back. We had a great time there, both because we got to see Mount Rushmore, but also because we got to see a Native American concert, which is pretty interesting considering that originally the land that Mount Rushmore is built upon was Native American land, but then it was stolen from them. This is unfortunately not something that's only happened once. No, there are a lot of cases, unfortunately, where land was taken from the Native Americans, and unfortunately, in many cases, Europeans look down on Native Americans as just being savages, barbarians, primitive, whatever word you want to use, basically because Native Americans did not ever have technology like the Europeans had. And so that meant that Europeans thought that they were a lot better than Native Americans. That led to Native Americans being treated pretty badly. So it's quite powerful that in this case, or you, me, and Mom went to Mount Rushmore, there was a Native American band that played right around Mount Rushmore. There's several other places that I've been to before in South Dakota. I mean, Dad, you and me remember how we've been to the Terry Redland Art Museum multiple times. That is a really great museum. It has over 160 original paintings done by Terry Redland, along with this video that you can watch there. It's a presentation that goes through. I don't know what was wrong with my voice there. It sounded a bit off, but there's this presentation you can watch there that goes through Terry Redland's whole life from childhood to death, and it really highlights that one of Terry Redland's greatest qualities is that he was always very humble, even though he had many fans, even though he was absolutely famous, even though he was inducted into several Hall of Fames. In fact, he won a lot of awards. He always stated that what he cared about more than anything else was just making people happy, not having a ton of fans or winning a lot of awards. In fact, even though Terry Redland is not alive anymore, his spirit lives on through the legacy that he left behind, because there's a whole museum dedicated to him. And therefore, his name and memory absolutely lives on. You remember, Dad, how the last time we went to the Terry Redland Art Museum, we saw the museum, but then we also did a little frisbee catch. We can both agree that was a lot of fun, am I right? in fact, Joe, I remember how back when you, Linda, and Jamie would come out to New York, which you did a couple times. Sometimes we would do frisbee catch, or we'd do a game. It was a ton of fun. And I think you'd agree that we had some great times back in New York. I mean, we did mini golf, we did bumper cars, or no, it was actually go-karting, not bumper cars, but we would go out to a mini golf course, and sometimes one that also had go-karts. We had a lot of fun doing that. Or sometimes it would go over to your guys' house, and you, me, and Jamie would. Yeah, Joe, I'd absolutely agree. I was fun. I remember how sometimes me, and Jamie would bring out these balloons and just hit them back and forth between each other. That was a ton of fun. And then I remember the time where me and my parents went out to Canton, Ohio to see you guys. We also had a lot of fun there. And I also, yeah, Jamie had a great time. Absolutely. And it's also pretty funny is that Dad baptized Jamie back when we all lived in New York, and he was the pastor of the Hope Reformed Church. In fact, I remember how back back then, you were also part of the softball team that I was a part of, the one that happened over the summers. In fact, Dad, you also participated in that softball team as well. You would come along to games. It was a lot of fun, Joe. Absolutely. We got to do baseball, and sometimes after the games were over, we would go and get ice cream somewhere. And the funny thing about baseball is I've been to more baseball games than I have football games or soccer games or basketball games, but I haven't played baseball before that often. I mean, if you're talking about a baseball game with two teams, 8 people on each team to fill out all the various positions, I haven't done that before. I certainly haven't. I haven't done that just for fun with friends because that's 16 people, quite a big group. Therefore, it's not easy to get that many people together. So I've never done a baseball game before with friends the way that it's done in Sandlot. I think we can all agree that is a great movie. And when it comes to sports movies, Sandlot is absolutely one of the classics. It's one of the most well known out of them all. You're killing me. You're killing me, Smalls. I've said I've said that line a lot of times before. It's quite memorable, and it's interesting is that the movie begins with the main character as an adult narrating about the one summer he had back when he was a kid where he made a lot of friends. He learned how to do baseball. So, Dad, have you seen that before? Joe, same for you as well. Feel free to post about that. I've watched quite a good amount of sports movies before. In fact, I actually own the movie Coach Carter. That one is about basketball, but that is a really good movie as well. And there's quite a good amount of sports movies that are on Disney Plus as well. Glory Road, Coach Carter, Sandlot, Remember the Titans. There are others for sure, but those are the ones that come to my mind immediately. In fact, Moneyball Hoosiers. I haven't heard of that one before, Joe. Do you know if that's on Disney Plus or some other streaming service? That actually, there's this movie I've seen before that there's a movie I've seen before that's called Moneyball. Yeah, I remember seeing this movie. It's about this guy who's created a computer program that analyzes a lot of data to find out who the best players are. I remember enjoying that movie. In fact, I remember that when I was a college student at SMSU, there was this one time where I saw the movie Remember the Titans on this big screen out at the sports field right next to the campus. This was during Gold Rush days, basically the week before class starts each semester, where there's a bunch of activities like slip and slide, kickball. Oh, Joe, Moneyball, not sure. Baseball about Oakland A's and Boston Red Sox. Yeah, that's exactly the movie that I'm referring to here. There is a bunch of activities during Gold Rush days like slip and slide, kickball, laser tag, sand volleyball, mud volleyball. The funny vein is that when I would go to mud volleyball, there were some people who would just jump into the dirt to the mud. Actually, they would be covered head to toe in mud. I remember thinking to myself, wow, I would not want to do that because that would take some time to clean off. Oh, Dad, yeah, I forgot about Radio. That is a great sports movie. Yeah, it's about this guy named Radio who is disabled because he's slower than most people, but he is very much a good person. But unfortunately, as his mom points out in the movie, most people don't take the time to see that. In fact, what's what's really heartwarming about that movie is the relationship that develops between Radio and the coach of the local football team, who is kind to Radio right from the start. I, do, Coach Harold, that's his name. Yeah, Coach Harold and Radio end up becoming close friends. It's really heartwarming to see. But at the same time, what is sad about that movie is that at the beginning we see Radio's mother, and we learn that the husband is not in the picture anymore because he's dead, and she works long hours at the hospital and so doesn't get to see her son that often. And then later on, we see Coach Harold, Radio, and Radio's mom celebrating Christmas together. And they're all having a really fun time, but then Radio's mom dies, and therefore that moment actually becomes rather sad, even heartbreaking in hindsight, when you realize that that was the last time that Radio saw his mom, and that was the one time that the three of them were all together. But at the same time, what is quite heartwarming is that one of the players of in the football team is rather mean to Radio at first. In fact, a bunch of players tie Radio up and then force him into this shed. We see that Radio is absolutely terrified. And thus, when Coach Harold finds out, as you can imagine, he's pretty angry. And so he has the players run a lot. So he doesn't even need to raise his voice or scream, because his actions alone demonstrate that he was angry. But then later on, one of the players, named Johnny, ends up actually becoming a good friend to Radio. Dad, I don't know how much as you remember, because it may have been a good amount of time. Probably it's been a good amount of time since you've last seen the movie. So, how much do you remember about it? Also, Joe, have you seen the movie before? Feel free to post about that. I've seen quite a good amount of sports movies before. In fact, another example would be Snow Dogs. This is a movie that I first saw a long time ago. In fact, when me and my parents lived in New York, we had a lot of VHS tapes, and a good amount of them. One of the movies that we had on VHS tape was Snow Dogs, which is a pretty funny movie. Joe, have you seen that movie before? But when it comes to radio, you have that scene where Johnny and his friends play a rather cruel prank on radio because they tell him that, hey, the girls want you to bring something to the girls' locker room. Radio at first is like, no, I don't want to do it. That doesn't seem right. But then they're all like, it's no problem. And radio does it, and it's, you can imagine he is rather ashamed. But then when Coach Harold questions Radio about who told you to do that in the first place, Radio refuses to tell Coach Harold that it was Johnny and his friends who told him to go into the girls' locker room in the first place. Basically, Radio refuses to rat out Johnny and his friends, even though he frankly had good reason to do so, because what Johnny and his friends did to Radio was not kind at all, was very mean. So Radio actually had good reason to be angry at them. And yet, despite that, not only does Radio not rat out Johnny and his friends, not only does he not tell on them, but he decides to take the blame for what happened, even though he absolutely did not need to do that at all. Coach Harold is very impressed with this. He flat out says, Radio, are you actually willing to do this? Are you actually willing to take the blame? Dad, that's good to hear that you remember a lot about this movie. And then later on, Johnny is very impressed that Radio did not tell on him after Coach Harold told him that, hey, Radio did not tell on you. And then Johnny ends up giving Radio a gift, and Radio does the same for Johnny. It's really heartwarming. And then right at the end, it's stated that Radio and Coach Harold remained friends for years, decades even. So Radio's very much a feel-good, heartwarming movie. A lot of sports movies are, unlike other types of movies which have a completely different tone to them. For example, if you're talking about horror movies, they're going to naturally have more of a dark tone, whereas if you're talking about a comedy, that's going to have a lot more of a lighthearted tone. But yeah, Joe, Rudy, that's another sports movie that I forgot about in the moment. Yeah, I've seen that movie before. That's another good one. And yeah, as you point out, it's another one that is definitely heartwarming. And then if you're talking about a thriller or a mystery, then that's going to have more of a suspenseful tone, because with a thriller, for example, one of the big points of that type of movie really is to put you on the edge of your seat where you're not sure what's going to happen next. I'm not sure how many thrillers I've actually seen before. There's a couple of comedies I really enjoy, like Elf, Mrs. Doubtfire, as well as Dumb and Dumber. Joe, have you seen any of those movies before? Also, Dad, I know that you've definitely seen those movies before. In fact, with the movie Elf, one of the moments that's really, really funny is when Buddy is with his family at the table for the first time, and then he chugs a whole thing of soda. a big bottle of it. And then he does this really loud burp and says, "Did you hear that?" And then his brother Michael is like, ah, "You are," while rolling his eyes. "Oh, you are so weird." Yeah, Joe, Dumb and Dumber is a really funny movie. Okay, I haven't seen it in a while. Yeah, so right at the beginning, we learn that one of the main characters is is a taxi driver or a cab driver. He's picking up this lady to take her to the airport. The funny thing is that as soon as he opens the door and sees her, romantic music starts to play. He's obviously thinking, "Oh wow, she's really pretty." And then he, he puts a he sprays he sprays perfume on himself, and then while he's driving the car, he's so focused on talking to this lady that he's not driving safe in any way. He's driving so unsafely that he fully turns his head around so he's not looking at the road at all, just to talk to her. And then we see that things are happening on the road. And so he could have easily caused both of them to be seriously injured as a result of this stunt. In fact, she even says, buddy, how about you focus on the road?" And then when they actually arrive at the airport, and therefore she's just about to go to not miss her flight, he's like, do you want a hug?" And then he hugs her. It's super awkward because they just met each other. She's obviously thinking, "What the heck? Why is this guy acting so emotional when I barely know him at all?" And then there's a different scene where an officer pulls over the two main characters' vehicle. He comes up to the window and he sees all these bottles that we know contain their piss because they didn't know how else to do it, and so they're obviously thinking, "Oh no." And the officer's like, "Hey, what you got there?" They try to play cool, be like, "Oh, nothing to see here, officer." He's like, "No, I'll actually take a look." Or like, no, that's not necessary." And he's like, "No, I will do it." And in fact, he's he's like, "Hey, you'll shut up if you know what's good for you." Joe, I'll see you around later. Thanks for coming on. Dad, feel free to stay for as long as you want. And then the officer drinks a piss. He literally starts to throw up as our two main characters drive away. and later on, one of the main characters, let's see, their names are Harry and Marvin. I think those are their names, but one of them rather pulls a prank on the other where they spike a drink this with this liquid that has the side effect of causing of causing one to have to go to the bathroom a lot. So then one of the guys drinks this and then he has to go really, really bad. So he goes to this bathroom, he uses the toilet, and then right after that, the lady who owns the house that he's staying at, the one that they went on a countrywide trip for, they did this all to give her back her suitcase, and so they traveled across the whole country to do it. She says to him like, "Hey, I hope you didn't use the toilet because it doesn't work." He's thinking, "Oh no, I just used it." it's pretty funny. Mrs. Doubtfire is also a pretty funny movie, though at the same time, one thing that's messed up if you think about it is just the way that our main character, some reason I'm blanking on the name, Daniel, yeah, Daniel Hiller, that's his name. Yeah, he ends up disguising himself as Mrs. Doubtfire in order to get closer to his kids. One of the other characters is named Stu. He has known his wife Miranda, Daniel's wife Miranda, for a good time because they're colleagues, basically. So he ends up coming back to town, and thus him and Miranda see each other again for the first time in a long time. After that, Miranda starts to see Stu, both because of the fact they've known each other for a good amount of time, and also because she and Daniel end up getting divorced from each other. So Stu is the new boyfriend. Basically, he goes over to the house to see the kids in order to meet them, and so he talks with them in order to build up good rapport with them. Daniel ends up getting jealous because him and Miranda used to be married. So he treats Stu pretty badly. I mean, he hits Stu on the back of the head with a lime, removes this thing from Stu's car, which actually is vandalism. And then, just as a nice little icing on the cake, at the end of the movie, he doesn't do anything that big. He just, tries. He just, oh yeah, puts spice onto this dish that Stu had ordered, even though Stu had told the waiter, make mine not spicy. I'm allergic to pepper. Daniel was there. He absolutely heard that, and yet he proceeds to put a huge amount of spice on Stu's dish, despite being well aware of the fact that this will cause Stu to have an allergic reaction. This could this could cause Stu great physical injury. So it's pretty messed up if you think about it, that Daniel decided to put a huge amount of spice on Stu's dish, despite the fact that this could have resulted in either Stu suffering serious physical injury or maybe even being killed for that matter. And then earlier on, Daniel, disguised as Mrs. Doubtfire, is at the house with Miranda, Stu, and the kids. Miranda's talking to Mrs. Doubtfire about whether she should be seeing Stu or not. Mrs. Doubtfire is like, no, that's not a good idea at all. And then while Mrs. Doubtfire is talking to Stu, she's like, oh, you got a pretty big, expensive car out there. But most sales are compensating for something if they have a rather big vehicle. Stu, that was a insult on Daniel's part against Stu because of what Daniel was insinuating through those words. But here's the thing, Stu doesn't seem like a bad guy in that movie. If we look at what he does and says, he seems like just a good guy who doesn't have any ulterior motives or any kind of nefarious intent. No, he seems pretty honest about his relationship with Miranda. Oh, Dad, you remember that movie, right? In fact, I remember how back in New York we watched a movie a good amount of times. In fact, I remember how we would do various strategy games like chess, Risk, Stratego, Dominion, Settlers of Catan, Stone Age, Pillars of the Earth. Those are all some of the ones that enjoy a lot. Though, admittedly, I haven't played Risk as often as other strategy games. The main reason for that being that if you use the base rules for the game, then it can definitely take a while. But at the same time, if you use different rules, then you can absolutely make the game faster. But I remember well how when I was a student at Byron Burgeon Central Schools, I was a part of the Strategic Games Club. We would do chess, risk, stratego. We did other strategy games as well, but I don't remember what those are. Dad, feel free to post about like games that you've done before, either board games, card games, video games, or anything that you want. Actually, I remember we did play the game Othello for the Strategic Games Club, but I don't remember other strategy games that we played back then. But I remember sometimes we would do a risk night where one day of the week after school, we'd all get together to do risk and have usually at least to have snacks and drinks for sure. There would be soda along with snacks. Sometimes there would be pizza, but not always. That was a lot of fun. And one year, we actually did something a little bit different. We went out to various schools in order to compete with students from those schools in chess. That was a lot of fun as well. In fact, all those games I mentioned just a minute or so ago are ones that I've owned for years. In fact, I have quite a good amount of board and card games. In fact, Dad, you remember how you, me, and Mom used to play games like Rumacube, Sequence, Phase 10, Five Crowns, Monopoly, Life. We had, we had a ton of fun. Although, admittedly, I haven't played games like Monopoly Life, so Monopoly Life, Scrabble, especially. Those ones I haven't played as often anyway. I've definitely played them before a decent amount of times, but not as much as other games. I've played Clue a bit. Well, actually, I haven't played that game too much either. I played Sorry more often. The funny thing actually is that just recently, if in the last 2 weeks, I've seen the movie version of Clue, which came out in 1985. It's a movie that I enjoyed mainly for sentimental reasons because I've owned a board game Clue for years. And then when I was a college student, I saw Clue the musical, along with other shows as well. For example, I saw Peter and the Starcatcher. In fact, Dad, you'll remember how you and Mom have seen shows at the dinner at the shand. What's it called? The dinner feeder. You guys have seen the musical version of Mamma Mia there before, which I think is really interesting because I think it would absolutely be awesome to go to a more fancy place like that. I've seen Mamma Mia as well as Mamma Mia 2, but I haven't seen the musical version or stage production version, basically, of Mamma Mia, similar to how I've seen the 2004 film adaptation of Phantom of the Opera, but I haven't seen the musical version of the story, though I have read the book. I haven't seen the other film adaptations of the story. There's been a good amount of them throughout the years. Some of them are older than others, but when it comes to current events, one that is major, though admittedly this happened a decent amount of time ago, is the fact that the British Queen died and her son Charles ended up becoming the new ruler. Admittedly, I don't know much about English politics. I'm not particularly familiar with them, but I remember one time I was watching a Galaxy of Heroes stream. The guy who was doing the stream, Arnold, he was talking about this. And also, there have been a decent amount of hurricanes that have happened recently. Definitely within the last 2 months, there's been some that have happened down in Florida. In fact, I remember one time I was participating in this Discord voice chat led by the YouTuber Thor Skywalker, along with his wife Sailor Naboo. There's one guy on there who does live in Florida. He showed us a view from right outside his house of pretty strong wind. But when when it comes to more recent events, not I'm not particularly I'm not particularly familiar with those. But when it comes to a family opera, what's interesting is that the movie is structured differently from the book. Dad, are you still there? Are you still there? Or have you left at this point? If you're still there, feel free to post just to let me know that you're still participating. But in the movie version of a family opera, the first scene shows the opera house at a point where it's not in a good state at all because there's dust everywhere. This is in the future. In fact, we see that items from the opera house are being sold at an auction. We also see Raoul being led into the opera house because someone else is pushing his wheelchair into the opera house, and then a certain point in the auction, the one who's running it says lot 666, then a chandelier in pieces. Some you may recall the strange affair of the Phantom of the Opera, a mystery never fully explained. We are told, ladies and gentlemen, that this is the very chandelier which figures in the famous disaster. Our workshops have repaired it, and wired parts of it from the new electric light. Perhaps we can frighten away the ghost of so many years ago with a little illumination. Gentlemen, then at that point, the music kicks in, and then the movie flashes back to a time when the opera house was in its prime, where there were a ton of people there. There were the choir girls with the along with the stage hands and the managers. Yeah, Dad, Risk is absolutely a fun game. It's not one I played as often, but it's one that I definitely enjoy. If you want to post about other games, go ahead and do that. In fact, I remember one time where Yumi and Mom went to this game store in the cities. Was in Roseville, was it? Oh, we went to this store that has quite a good amount of board and card games in it. Ah, and Dad, feel free to stay here as long as you can. You remember this, right? Where we went to a game store and we ended up playing this game called Tigris and Euphrates, and then you and me looked at anyway this game called Pandemic, which is one that I'm familiar with. I know it's a co-op game where you're trying to survive this pandemic. We didn't actually play it when we were at a game store just because we didn't have the time, but we absolutely looked at the rules, started taking the pieces out of the box. At this point, I still haven't played that game, but I definitely know about know about it. There's actually a game pretty similar to Tigris and Euphrates that I own. Dad, do you remember what that's called? I don't remember off the top of my head. But also, the game Lost Cities is one that you and me have played many times before. We've always really enjoyed that game, along with, let's see, the funny thing with Scrabble actually is that Grandma really enjoyed that game a lot. In fact, I re- I remember when we used to play Scrabble. Sometimes you or me would pull out the dictionary to find some obscure word that we weren't familiar with. That was pretty funny. But I also, for a long time, have owned Battleship, um, along with Categories, Taboo, in a pit, in a pickle. I mean, Pit, Triominoes, Ticket to Ride. That's actually one day that you and me have enjoy a lot is Ticket to Ride. We own Ticket to Ride Europe specifically, not the standard Ticket to Ride, but a variation on it called Ticket to Ride Europe. That's pretty similar. All the rules are pretty much the same. There's just a few minor differences. Categories and Taboo are both similar in that they both involve words, but the difference is that with categories, you have a category, like, say, food. Then you're trying to come up with as many words as you can that fit into said category that also start with one specific letter. You roll a dice, and if you get a B, for example, and the category is food, then you're trying to come up with as many words as you can think of that fall under the category of food, which also start with a B. Whereas with Taboo, the way that works is that you have a sheet that has various words on it, and you're trying to get someone else to guess what the words are without directly saying the word. Give it you're just able to give hints so that the other person can get so the other person can guess it. Yellow, yeah, like, oh, Dad, I'm thinking out yellow Yaxi. I maybe maybe that's it. I'm blanking right now, but there's also games I used to own which I don't anymore. Some of the really simple ones like Hangman or Connect Four. In fact, when it comes to Hangman, you don't even need the actual physical game that comes in a box because all you actually need is just like a piece of paper or a blackboard, something that you can write on, and then just a writing utensil, a pen or pencil, whatever the case may be. And then with just those things, you can play the game Hangman. I used to own Connect Four, but over time, the box became more and more worn out. It the quality of it decreased over time, and so that led to me not having that game anymore. But I still own Battleship, although Interestingly, I have the non-digital version of Battleship, the more you could say old school version. I've played the digital version of Battleship before with a friend. That was a lot of fun. In fact, actually, with this same group of people, I also played laser tag. That was a lot of fun, especially because I haven't played laser tag that often before. I've done it a couple times, but not a huge amount of times either. There are other activities I've done a lot more often, but I think laser tag is a lot of fun. Just like how I think paintball is a lot of fun, but I haven't played it that often. I played it when I went on mission trips down to Texas. These are spring break mission trips that I went to along with Crew, the Christian organization at SMSU that I was a part of. Both times I went on this mission trip with them, we did paintball. So I think it's a lot. I think it's a lot of fun, but at the same time, if you don't have the proper equipment, you can even technically even with that equipment, get you can get hurt when if you go to a paintball course, then they'll give you a helmet along with other equipment to wear in order to minimize anyway the chances that you will end up getting hurt, and especially if you don't come out that often, if you don't come out of cover that often while you're actually doing paintball, then you can for the most part avoid getting injured. If you go out into the open, that's a different story. Because I've seen people before that have like gotten little bruises or like little welts as a result of getting hit by that ball, because it comes at you at high speed. Once the ball is fired from the gun, then it's coming at you really fast. So especially if it hits you on bare skin, then it definitely hurts. To me. That happened to me when I did paintball, but thankfully get I did not get injured as much as other people did. There's a lot of outdoor activities that I've done before. And I really enjoy going swimming or going out on a boat or going out on a tube or going jet skiing. I haven't done wakeboarding or kneeboarding before, where you're either sitting down on your knees on these things or standing upright. I didn't do a very good job of describing these activities, but haven't done those specific. I haven't done those specifically before. Going back for a minute to Phantom of the Opera, in the way that the 2004 movie is structured, is that it starts off with a flash forward to a later point, and in fact, everything is black and white in these flash forwards, and then it flashes back to the past. But then throughout the movie, there are the occasionally these flash forwards happen, and then the last scene of the movie shows us the old Raoul in a wheelchair going to Christine Daae's grave. You see it says on the grave, this year to this year, Christine Daae, beloved wife and mother. And that is something that's different from the book. The book is not structured this way, where you have the two different timelines basically, the one in the future and then the one in the past. In the book, there's really only one timeline. With the movie, actually, right before it cuts to credits, we see that there's this flower on Christine's grave. More specifically, we see this red rose on Christine's grave that's very powerful because earlier in the movie we saw this red rose multiple times, and by the end of the film you realize that the rose is a physical example of the connection between the Phantom and Christine. Really, the rose represents the connection that the two of them shared. So it's very powerful. In fact, one of the most powerful scenes is right at the end when Christine actually shows the Phantom kindness. Aside from Madame Jury, no one else before Christine had shown the Phantom any kind of kindness or compassion. On the one hand, the Phantom is not at all justified in committing murder, but on the other hand, we can definitely feel sympathy for him because he lived a life consumed by darkness and tragedy. Madame Jury, along with Christine Daae, were the only bits of good in his life. In fact, just a bit earlier on, after the Phantom has led Christine down to his lair, he says that his own mother didn't love him at all. Specifically, he says, "This face which earned a mother's fear and loathing." That is very, very, very sad. In the book, the Phantom actually is named Eric, so he actually does have a name, unlike in the 2004 film where he just doesn't have a name at all. And Dad, if you're still there, feel free to post about any kind of movie, book, TV show, or whatever you want. When it comes to the MCU, I've been a fan of this franchise for a while, but at the same time, unfortunately, I do feel that the quality recently has dropped. I feel like Phase 4 is weaker than previous phases. So I feel like there's been too much focus on quantity rather rather than quality. And so and therefore I haven't even been watching She-Hulk at all. I've been following along with the show by watching YouTube videos. Dad, that's a good point there. That seems very likely that the Phantom placed the rose that we see right at the end on Christine's grave. That would only make complete sense, both because of the fact that, like I said earlier, that rose really was what represented the bond between Christine and the Phantom, but also because in the movie, unlike in the book, the Phantom doesn't die in the end. He escapes to somewhere. We have no clue where that place is, but he escapes through one of the mirrors, and so we don't know what exactly happens to him afterward. Whereas in the book, it's indicated that the Phantom or Eric willed himself to die of a broken heart because he thought that without Christine, what do I have to live for? And so he basically allowed himself to die. I think it would be really interesting to see a Broadway musical. I've seen musicals before, yes, but ones that are more informal, casual, not more formal ones. I saw theater productions when I was a high school student. For example, I saw The Wizard of Oz as a theater production at Byron Burgeon, and like I was saying before, I saw theater productions at SMSU, but those are just school ones. They're not all that formal. They're more casual. So I think it would be really, really interesting to, for example, go to Broadway and see a stage production there because that's on a completely different level than just a school stage production or a college stage production. But I have, however, seen the Broadway musical Hamilton on Disney Plus. That was originally a Broadway stage production. I don't remember off the top of my head when exactly it came out, but after it was done live on Broadway, the show was put on Disney Plus. So it's not actually a movie at all. It literally is the Broadway musical, just after the fact, of course, not live. But when you watch it, you can see that everyone is in costume, and they all are wearing a mic. They're all are wearing a microphone, and they're singing the whole time. In fact, when it comes to musicals, I remember seeing at one point the French musical Les Mis. I saw that when I was a college student at SMSU. I saw it with some people that I knew from crew. It's the type of musical where there's almost no dialogue throughout the whole film because almost almost all the time everyone is singing all of the words. They're not actually just speaking the words. Pretty much every scene consists of people just singing. They do what I like to call scene talking, where they're not where there's almost no actual dialogue because everyone is for the most part just singing while they're talking. That's not really the type of musical that I'm into because if you look at The Sound of Music or Phantom of the Opera, what you'll notice is that there is definitely more dialogue. The movie is not 90 is not composed almost entirely of singing. There's a decent amount of scenes where characters are just simply talking. Also, Les Mis is a movie that ends on a bittersweet note, and it's in general more dark, more somber. It's not like a light-hearted movie, so that makes me not have too much desire to actually rewatch it. But if I'm looking just at the acting, the dialogue, visuals, story, and it's very good. Uh, Dad, glad that you came on today. That was a good talk. The way I would describe it is this: on an objective level, I would say Les Mis is pretty good. If I'm looking just at all the elements that are really important to what makes a good movie, like the writing, acting, dialogue, all of the all those elements, visuals are admittedly not quite as important. I mean, I would say that writing, acting, dialogue are more at the core of what makes a good movie. Visuals are kind of icing on the cake. If a movie has great visuals, then that's a great bonus for sure. If a movie has terrible visuals, then that definitely does not help. So On an objective level, I'd say Les Mis is pretty good, but on a subjective level, it's not a movie that is necessarily easy to watch because it's not all that entertaining or lighthearted. So it's not a movie that I personally enjoy as much, but I can definitely say that it's absolutely a great movie. But I am really looking forward to Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I hope that that is a great movie, especially because I really, really enjoyed the first film. It's one of my favorite movies in this entire franchise. I like how it establishes the world of Wakanda. I think the villain is really, really good as well. But I'm also curious to see how Black Panther Wakanda Forever is going to handle the character of T'Challa due to the tragic and unexpected passing of the actor Chadwick Boseman, who played the character in the first film. Originally, yeah, yeah, Dad, I did see your message there, and that we had a good talk. Thanks for coming on today. Yeah, I'm responding to your message in in the chat now. I should have responded a couple minutes ago. At the time, I was talking, so I didn't actually respond to your message at first. But Black Panther Wakanda Forever was originally written under the assumption that Chadwick Boseman was actually going to play the character of Black Panther, but then unfortunately he died, so the film had to be rewritten to account for Chadwick Boseman's death. So the trailers, other promotional material have already showed us that the film is going to deal with the in-universe death of T'Challa. We're going to see T'Challa's family along with other Wakandans reacting to this tragic event, especially because I haven't been enjoying MCU content as much lately. I'm hoping that Black Panther Wakanda Forever is great. I'd say that Endgame, Infinity War, Black Panther, Captain America, Winter Soldier, as well as Civil War are some of my favorites out of all the MCU films. Dad, I'm actually not going to sign off yet. I'm gonna keep talking for a bit here, just in case someone else does end up joining the chat. And I'm not going to go on for too much longer anyway, but I'm going to continue for a bit so that if someone does actually join the chat, that I can have a conversation with them as well, like I had a com- conversation with you and Joe. But yeah, Dad, yeah, Dad. Glad, I'm glad to hear you say. Glad to hear you. Glad to hear you say that. Yeah, you're welcome as well. But I'd say that For the Dark World is one of my least favorite MCU films. Iron Man 2 is the one that I actually think is bad. For the Dark World, as well as Avengers: Age of Ultron, and uh, and yeah, those two really are the ones that I would consider to be more average or more generic, more forgettable, more mediocre than other MCU films are. Those are ones I haven't actually rewatched any time anytime recently. So, in fact, I don't have much desire to actually rewatch those films. I mean, I easily could rewatch them if I wanted to because they're on Disney Plus, but I don't. When it comes to Captain America Civil War, I think that Zemo is really, really good villain because, for one, he's very unique in that he doesn't have any superpowers, unlike a lot of other MCU villains. But even more than that, he doesn't actually have some piece of technology that would make him any kind of physical threat to our heroes. If you look at a lot of Iron Man's villains, like Whiplash, Justin Hammer, or Ivan Vanko, none of them have any kind of powers at all, but they have some piece of technology that makes them in some way a physical threat to Tony. Zemo doesn't have that at all, but yet he still manages to divide the Avengers. In fact, he does it just by manipulating events behind the scenes. And in fact, what also makes Zemo really stand out is that in the end, he wins. He achieves exactly what he set out to achieve. His goal was to tear the Avengers apart. And in the end, that's exactly what he ends up doing. Also, I think the airport battle is awesome. I love that scene because we get to see all the heroes use their abilities in really creative ways, especially when Ant-Man becomes Giant Man for the first time. And in fact, what's funny about that scene is that most of the characters are adults, and then Spider-Man is only a teenager, so he's getting really excited. Therefore, he's basically fanboying out, even to the point where the other characters are saying to Tony, "Geez, how old is this kid?" Basically, he's acting like such a teenager. In fact, actually, Rhodey is the one who directly tells Steve. I know it's Fal. Yeah, it's Rhodey. He tells Tony, "Geez, Tony, how old is this kid?" And then Tony goes, "I don't know. I didn't carbon date him. He's a bit on the young side." And then at a different point, Spider-Man is starting to geek out after he's webbed up both both Bucky as well as Falcon or Sam Wilson. And Sam literally says, "I don't know if you've been in a fight before, but there's usually not this much talking." But at the same time, it's pretty messed up if you think about it that Tony brought Spider-Man to the airport battle. The main reason why I say that is because of the fact that, unlike all the other people who are at the airport here, Peter Parker is just a teenager. What this means is that Peter is a lot younger and more inexperienced than these other people are. He doesn't have anywhere near as much he doesn't have anywhere near as much training or experience as the other heroes here, especially in comparison to someone like Steve Rogers, who's been a soldier for a long, long time. And when you look at Tony, he hasn't been a soldier for as long as Steve has, but he's very wealthy, has a lot of resources at his disposal. So it was really irresponsible on Tony's part to actually bring Peter into this fight. The main reason for that is because the truth is, Peter could have easily been either seriously injured or even killed, for that matter. And what makes this even worse is the fact that Tony treats Aunt May really badly because he knowingly sneaks Peter out of the house to get him over to the airport without Peter's guardian May's knowledge or consent. Yeah, that is really messed up if you think about it. Aunt May was the one who was Peter's aunt. She was Peter's legal guardian, and she was the only family that Peter actually has. So it's really really messed up that Tony sends Peter off to this battle where he could have easily been either seriously injured or killed without Aunt May's knowledge or consent. In fact, you'd in fact if Aunt May ever finds out about what Tony did, she would be mad. And then in Spider-Man Far From Home, we learn that Tony has left these glasses called called Edith to Peter, even though Peter is an inexperienced, naive teenager who has been dead for 5 years, and even though there are a lot of other people who Tony could have given the glasses to instead. You'd expect that Tony would realize what would be a lot smarter is to, for example, give Happy Hogan the glasses because Happy's an adult who has worked at Stark Industries for quite a good amount of time. He's been the head of security, so he would probably know how to handle these glasses responsibly. Or Tony could have given the glasses to Pepper Potts, who Tony knew for a long time. By the time of Spider-Man Far From Home, Tony and Pepper were back together. Plus, Pepper was the head of Stark Industries. So you'd think Tony would realize that Pepper would be a really good choice as the one to have Edith. Or even barring that, Tony could have given Rhodey the glasses, considering that he's an adult a part of who's been a part of the military for a long time. He would certainly know how to handle these glasses responsibly. But instead, for some reason, Tony decides that Peter is the one who should have the glasses. And even, therefore, things end up getting really bad as a result of this bafflingly idiotic decision on Tony's part. Why? Because, first of all, Peter accidentally almost kills one of his fellow classmates. That alone shows that Peter was absolutely not prepared at all to use Edith responsibly. And then Peter makes the really, really stupid decision of giving the glasses to Quentin Beck, even though Peter had only known Quentin Beck for a couple of days. This ends up backfiring horribly because, as it turns out, Quentin Beck was actually the mastermind the whole time. He was the villain. So, because Peter gives Quentin Beck the glasses, he's able to orchestrate the attack on London, which causes, for sure, a lot of property damage and maybe loss of life as well. And then, Quentin Beck is able to rat out Peter as Spider-Man to the whole world, which then leads into the events of Spider-Man No Way Home, where things just end up getting worse and worse. What we see in Spider-Man No Way Home is that because Peter was ratted out as Spider-Man in front of the whole world, his life has been turned upside down. This leads to him turning to Doctor Strange for help. This leads to the two of them trying to cast this spell to make everyone forget about Peter being Spider-Man. The spell ends up getting out of control due to Stephen Strange losing control of the spell. This leads to individuals from different universes coming into the universe that Stephen Strange and Peter are in. This whole chain of dominoes eventually leads to Doctor Strange casting this spell to make everyone forget who Peter Parker is, which is horrible because it means that Peter is not remembered by anyone. So when you look at all this, what you realize is this all started because Tony, for some reason, thought it was a good idea to give these incredibly powerful glasses to a naive and inexperienced high school student who pretty much certainly would not be prepared to handle this type of power responsibly, rather than giving these glasses to any one of any number of trusted adults that Tony knew, like Happy Hogan or Pepper Potts or Rhodey or one of the other Avengers, whatever the case may be. And in fact, at the end of Spider-Man: No Way Home, what we're seeing is is the worst thing possible happening to Peter Parker, him becoming completely alone because no one remembers him at all. This is about the worst thing possible that could happen to someone, to not be remembered by any of their loved ones. And then when it comes to Avengers Endgame, I love the way that the movie ends when when Tony, Steve, and Thor confront Thanos. It's really powerful because when these characters first met each other back in the Avengers, the three of them were fighting amongst each other. But now in Endgame, we see that instead they're all fighting together against Thanos. And then Steve ends up wielding Mjolnir, which is a really clever callback to the subtle moment from Avengers: Age of Ultron, where Steve nearly lifts Mjolnir. He doesn't end up lifting it, but you can see on Thor's face he's thinking, "What exactly is go- What exactly is going on?" But then in Endgame, Thor's like, I knew it. And then we get to see Steve for a bit absolutely demolish Thanos using Mjolnir until Thanos ends up getting the upper hand. But that moment is awesome. It is just amazing. See, for the first time ever, Steve wielding Mjolnir. But then Thanos ends up taking Mjolnir out of Steve's hands, and then Steve's shield gets almost sliced in half, and his arm is broken. Then, to make things even worse, Thanos' whole army shows up onto the battlefield, and then we see Steve, despite the fact that his shield is nearly broken in half and his arm's broken, he stands up anyway to face down Thanos's entire Thanos's entire army, and then the portals open. And all of our heroes and armies come through. We see all of the Guardians of the Galaxy, along with the other Avengers. They come through, along with the army of Wakanda, the Asgardians, and the Ravagers. It's incredible to see this moment where finally all these heroes and all these armies are gathered together to fight against the ultimate bad guy, that being Thanos. But going back a bit to when Steve faces off against Thanos' whole army, what's really powerful here is that while there's no while there's no way that Steve could have possibly prevented Thanos on his there's no way that Steve could have stopped Thanos on his own, because he didn't stand a chance against Thanos' entire army. But the simple fact that he chooses to stand up anyway is powerful, because Steve is basically saying, I'm not going to stop fighting until I am dead. I'm going to fight until my last breath. That shows exactly what type of person Steve is. He's someone who never gives up no matter what. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, Steve was the paragon of the MCU. He's more fundamentally good than anyone, and more than anyone else. Steve was always a pure, innocent soul, was good at heart. He remained that way despite everything that changed. And then at the end of Endgame, we see Steve finally with Peggy. We see him happy. It's so incredibly heartwarming. And then when Tony snaps his fingers to cause Thanos and his entire army to turn to dust, it's incredibly powerful because Tony chooses to make the ultimate sacrifice. He sacrifices himself to save the entire universe. Especially when you go back to how Tony was in Iron Man, how flawed he was. It's so powerful to see how far he's come, how much more selfless he's become, whereas before he was a lot more selfish. In the end, Tony's the one who makes the sacrifice play. You go back to the Avengers, Steve says, Tony, you would never make the sacrifice play. Basically saying, you're too selfish for that. You couldn't possibly perform a selfless act. But ultimately, that's exactly what Tony does. And then after Tony snaps his fingers, Pepper says, "You can rest." It's powerful because earlier on in the movie, Pepper says, "Tony, yeah, you don't need to do this. You don't need to investigate this time travel further. But if you did that, would you be able to rest?" And then in the end, Pepper is the one who says, "You can rest now, Tony." And then after that, we cut to Tony's funeral. We see all of the Avengers, all of the Guardians of the Galaxy, everyone's there to honor the hero Tony. In fact, we see this wreath of flowers going out to the ocean. There's this there's this arc reactor on there on this wreath of flowers. And around it we see the words "proof that Tony has a heart." An incredibly powerful moment because of the fact that in the first film, Tony Tony instructed Pepper to destroy the first arc reactor that he built in the cave when he was captured by terrorists. He built his first suit and arc reactor in that cave with Ho Yinsen. In fact, that was the start of Tony's redemptive arc. That's where his journey began. Then once he got back to the US, he told Pepper to destroy that arc reactor. She didn't end up doing that. She not only saved Tony's life at the end of the first film, but then Endgame calls back to that because in the first film, Tony sees that Pepper decided to instead put that first arc reactor in this box with the words "proof that Tony has a heart." So that moment in Endgame is really powerful because it's calling back to the first film, calling back to where this all started for Tony, calling back to his time in the cave with Ho Yinsen, who left an impact on Tony, even though Tony didn't end up spending that much time with Ho Yinsen. The time he did get to spend with him ended up being quite important. But that is where I'm going to end. That is where I'm going to end things for today, though. So I'll be back on a later day with another stream. My next stream will be next week on next week on the same day on Saturday at the same time on the same time as today. So I'll be back live then. So now this is Parma Merrydog or Sean Mary signing off. Peace.